Alright, let's go through the very basics of how to chalk paint furniture and how to top coat chalk paint with wax. If you already know the basics, stick around because after that we're going to dive into some of the things you might want to do to make your chalk painted furniture even better. Or if you just want to do the basics, that's great too. Let's dive into how to chalk paint furniture for beginners. Here's the dresser we're going to chalk paint today. When you get up close to it, it might look similar to your furniture. Beaten up, damaged a little bit, but that's okay. We're going to paint this dresser and give it a new life. First up, we remove the hardware. Knobs and pulls are usually held on with screws from the inside of the drawers, so we just need to loosen those screws to remove the hardware. Then we need to clean our furniture with some sort of degreasing cleaner and a wet rag. I personally use Crud Cutter, but you can use dish soap mixed in warm soapy water or TSP. We want to remove everything that will make our paint not stick. So, wax, furniture polish, oils from our hands, stickers, dirt, grime, and dust will all make our paint not stick. Basically, some of these things repel paint while others just block the paint from sticking to the real surface. And then our paint will easily scratch off or even peel off. So we want to scrub the surface to get all of those things off of it before we paint. I personally like to rinse the surface with a clean wet rag after I clean it with a cleaner, just to make sure that the cleaner isn't leaving a residue that will repel the paint as well. Then we let it completely dry. If your furniture is anything like mine, it probably has scratches, dings, and even broken corners and chipped up wood. If things like this don't bother you, you can totally skip past this step. But if you want to fix them, I have a really quick and easy trick for you. You can use this stuff called Quickwood to fill in and fix the damage that's bigger than a scratch. It feels kind of like clay, so you can shape it easily. It also is the best way to fill the hardware holes so you can change out the hardware. For this piece, I wanted to change the drawer pulls to knobs, so I just filled in one hole from each of the hardware. Quickwood dries in an hour, so you can sand it down flush and get on your way with the rest of the project pretty quickly. After I'm done painting, I can easily replace that hardware with new knobs now. Now for the paint. Chalk paint doesn't require you to sand or prime before you paint. That's true, but not for every single piece of furniture. I'll talk more about that later and how you can know if it will work for your piece. For this project, I used Country Chic Paint's chalk paint, which has excellent adhesion, just like Annie Sloan's chalk paint. I ended up mixing a few different colors of paint to create this color. I love Country Chic Paint's colors. It's also a no VOC water-based paint that has great coverage. And then I painted it on using Country Chic Paint's oval paintbrush. You can use whatever paintbrush you want. When I started painting furniture, I honestly just used the paintbrushes from the dollar store. And there's a reason I don't use those anymore, but if you just need something cheap, they'll work. Zebra paintbrushes are my go-to brushes now because they are so affordable, but they are so much better quality than the dollar store paintbrushes. The better quality paintbrush you use, the better your paint will look. You can also spray or roll the chalk paint on if you want. Do whatever floats your boat. I like to get the paint into the corners and the grooves first, and then I brush it out from there. I personally like to paint with the direction of the wood grain. This just helps hide the brush marks just a little bit more. But you can honestly paint whichever way you want to. If you want a textured look, you can paint it all on in different directions. Have fun with it. Whatever way you paint it on, try not to overload your paintbrush though. Try to only get paint on the bottom like 1/4 inch of the paintbrush, so you don't end up painting it on super thick. The paint dries faster and it also adheres better if you paint it on thinner. Be on the lookout for paint drips. They happen when too much paint is in one area. If you see a paint drip, brush it away with a paintbrush that isn't full of paint already. Paint drips are easier to get rid of when they are wet, but if you see them after they're dry, you can sand them out with 220 grit sandpaper or scrape it off with a sharp razor blade. As for the drawers, you can leave the drawers in or pull them out and put them on the ground. I like to do a mixture of both. It's easier on my back to paint them while they're in the furniture, then after they're painted, I remove them and set them on the ground. If you push them back in when the paint is wet, they will get stuck. So be very careful of that. You can use painter's tape to tape off the sides of the drawers and make sure you don't get any paint where you don't want it to be. I just work carefully with a brush that doesn't have much paint on it to try to not get the paint on the sides of the drawers. You can paint the sides too if you want, it's just more to paint. If I get some paint inside the drawers or on the sides of the drawers, I sand it away after the paint is dry. When I'm done painting the first coat and I'm just waiting for the paint to dry, I put the lid back on my paint and I wrap my paintbrush in either tin foil or plastic wrap to keep it from drying out. You can also just wash it out with warm soapy water between coats too. Then the paint should be dry in about 30 minutes to an hour depending on the temperature and humidity where you're painting. And once it's dry to the touch, you can start painting the next coat. Here's what the paint looked like after I painted a second coat, just an hour or so later. The wood was only showing in places where I brushed the paint on super thin. I like full coverage, so I brushed another light coat all over. The second coat goes on the same as the first coat. The paint covers very well, another reason why I love it. Before I started to paint again, I put the drawers back in so I could see what it would look like with all the drawers in. And can you see all of that wood that's showing around the drawers? That's because I didn't paint inside of the dresser at all. With drawers that are sitting flush with the front of the dresser, there's always a very good chance that you will see the inside of the dresser just a little bit. So it's a good idea to put the drawers back in after they're dry so you can make sure that you painted everything that you need to. I just left them in and then painted those areas, and then I pulled the drawers out and finished painting the second coat. And then set them down on the floor to dry. Here's what it looked like after the second coat was dry. The paint had full coverage everywhere. The next step is to top coat the chalk paint. I'll share how to top coat with wax in a minute, but let's talk about why we top coat chalk paint first. Yeah, unfortunately, chalk paint really needs to be top coated. When you touch it with even clean hands, it gets a white residue that kind of looks like dust, and you just can't wipe it away. Chalk paint is very porous, meaning that it's kind of like a sponge and will soak up anything that gets on it. So it's not water resistant at all, and you can't just wipe off whatever gets on it. And honestly, chalk paint by itself, especially if there wasn't any sanding or priming before, is just not very durable. It can scratch and ding pretty easily. So we need a top coat to seal the chalk paint in. The original way of top coating chalk paint is with wax, so that's why I'm sharing it with you today. It's really easy to use too. It's best to let the chalk paint dry for at least a couple of hours before you apply wax. Applying the wax right away can rub off the chalk paint in some areas, so we want to let the chalk paint dry more before we top coat it. Unless you want a rubbed, distressed look. Then you can start waxing once the paint feels completely dry. You can use a stiff bristled brush to brush the wax on, or you can even use a lint-free cloth like a t-shirt or even an old sock. My very favorite wax is the Soft Wax by the Real Milk Paint Company. It doesn't stink and it is so soft and buttery. You know the saying, wax on, wax off, and that's exactly how you apply wax over chalk paint. Brush or wipe it on in a small section, and then wipe the excess off with a clean cloth. The more you rub at the wax, the glossier it will get. So if you want less sheen, don't rub it as much when you're removing the excess. And if you want it to look glossier, buff it out more. Then move on to the next section. A brush makes it so much easier to get into the grooves and details, so even a cheap chip brush can make a big difference here. Top coating with a water-based polyurethane is probably the next most popular method. They each have their pros and cons, and some people prefer one over the other. I shared more about the differences in my blog post, so click over there if you're interested to know more. Then you can put your hardware back on. I changed out the old hardware and put these black knobs on instead. I think it completely changes the look of the dresser. What do you think? Now you just need to let the paint and wax cure. It usually takes about 21 to 30 days for paint and wax to cure, which means that it can still scratch very easily until it's fully dried after 30 days. So you might want to be extra careful with setting things on the surface and when you use your furniture until that curing time is over. After 30 days, the paint and wax will be as hard and durable as it's going to get. You can dust it off with a dry cloth, and if you spill anything on it, clean it up immediately. And just like any other furniture, don't let moisture get onto it. If it gets scuffed up, you can put more wax onto it. Now you're ready to chalk paint your furniture. If you want to learn even more about chalk painting furniture, stick around for these frequently asked questions. If this video has been helpful, please hit the like and subscribe buttons and leave us a comment. Let us know about your next project. Does chalk paint scratch easily? Well, if you don't properly prep before painting chalk paint, then yes, it can scratch easily. If you haven't top coated your chalk paint, it will be able to scratch easily too. If you've taken the steps to prepare your surface for paint, it shouldn't scratch easily even without a top coat on it. How do you prepare a dresser for chalk paint? For best results with chalk paint, it's really the best to clean with a degreasing cleaner, then scuff sand with 220 grit sandpaper just to dull the finish, but also to help sand out the scratches. We don't need to go down to raw wood here. Then prime the dresser with a shellac-based primer or clear shellac. Then you can paint. And then top coat with your choice of top coat. Do you have to sand before using chalk paint? Like I mentioned earlier, some pieces of furniture you can get away with not sanding. This piece didn't really have a slick surface, so I chalk painted it without sanding or priming. 24 hours after I painted, I tested the strength of the chalk paint, and it easily scratched off the sides of the dresser. It did hold on to the drawers really well though, but a week after top coating it with wax, the paint didn't scratch as easily anymore on any part of the dresser. So you can take your chance and not scuff sand before you paint. You might not get as good results though. How to chalk paint without sanding. If you don't want to have to sand before you chalk paint, but you don't want to worry about the chalk paint adhering really well, I recommend priming with a shellac-based primer before painting. It's as easy as spraying paint. I love this clear shellac in a spray can. Shellac blocks bleed through. If you don't know what bleed through is, head over to my video about bleed through. It also makes paint, especially chalk paint, stick to the surface so well. So just spray the clear shellac onto your furniture, let it dry for an hour, and then paint. I love the clear shellac because it dries clear, so you can't even tell that it's there when you paint and distress it. If you're painting with white chalk paint, Bin Shellac Base Primer is a white primer that has shellac in it. So it also makes chalk paint stick very, very well, but also makes it so you don't have to paint as many coats of white paint. Both versions come in a regular paint can as well, so you can brush or roll it on instead of spraying it on. If you don't want to use shellac because of its smell, then the white water-based 123 primer works alright, but it won't block bleed-through stains. How to repaint chalk paint furniture that was waxed? Some people say that you can just paint right over the waxed chalk paint. You can try that. Or you can even test in an inconspicuous area to see if it just scratches right back off after 24 hours. Wax repels water and water-based paint, so the chalk paint will most likely just scratch off super easily. For best results, remove the wax with mineral spirits and an old rag. After the surface is dry, you can paint it again, and then top coat it again. That's it for me today. I'm sharing even more facts at the end of my blog post. There's just too much information to share in this video. Anyway, if you have any questions or tips for me, leave them in the comments. And I'll catch you on our next video.